Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about sieges in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, a very popular topic of conversation. Well, maybe not quite so much, but still an important one. Remains to be seen what Creative Assembly will do with sieges going forward with 7.0, with the next proving grounds where they're going to add changes to sieges, all of that kind of stuff. But it is an important conversation point. In fact, just today, I saw a conversation on Reddit, I engaged in that, on the subject that when a settlement is attacked, the defender has to wait until their end turn ends before they can react to it. So for instance, me besieging the Red Fortress over here, it's going to take until the Imperial Wardens have their turn for them to react to it. If I'm being besieged, similar situation. And it can be annoying, especially when you have very small armies besieging a settlement. Now, of course, some people rightly point out that, well, in a lot of cases when besieging settlements, we'll be the ones outnumbered, outmatched. And so, if you allow a defender to react instantly, what will end up happening is we won't get any more siege battles, because vast majority of times the AI will just sally out, especially if they have an army and a powerful garrison. To which my reply is, okay, so we would have no more sieges. Anyway, what would be so terrible about that? Actually, I think at this point, it would be pretty freaking awesome to have that dynamic. Because when you have a situation of besieging a settlement, you have a choice as a player. And it's kind of a bad choice. You can either attack instantly and then fight a 40-man army inside the settlement, which is not a fun dynamic at the moment. Lots of units and high leadership because of the way settlements work. And the AI is being very passive. They'll stick in their settlement even though if their army could overwhelm you on the field of battle. In fact, there's many situations in many campaigns I've played where I know I may not win a field battle against AI, but I will win a siege. Simply because the passivity of the AI. So it's a combination of both battle AI problems and the limitations on the campaign map with regards to that. So I think the ability of instantly reacting to a settlement being besieged would really spice things up. Maybe for the worse, maybe for the better, but if the only argument people have against it, and to be clear, even on Reddit, people were like, okay, so we wouldn't have to face fewer sieges. It's like, yes, please do so. That would be freaking awesome to have fewer sieges in a campaign. Really. It would also potentially make your campaigns harder and really force you as a player to not just abuse certain things like the bad AI, because the AI is going to handle field battles a lot better than it will siege battles. So just worth pointing out. It's also the kind of situation where you know an opponent is very strong, but you also know you can at least weaken them by besieging their settlement and doing some level of attrition and also doing some damages. But in particular, if you have range units or if you have magic, and even if you're a pure melee faction, you can still do it. There's many things you can abuse. But how did we end up in this situation of bad siege dynamics, of the constant, never-ending settlement battles, of the auto-resolve, etc.? Well, here's a couple of reasons why we did so. It really goes back to Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2. We could go back into the history of Total War, but we're talking about Warhammer 3 here, so it's kind of important to talk about how things worked in previous games. In Warhammer 1 and 2, sieges, or specifically walled settlements, gave a defender a fairly substantial advantage, in the sense that walls offered significant protection to units from range fire. Of course, that creates balance issues, but on the flip side of that, a settlement did not have any inherent auto-resolve benefit, which they do in Warhammer 3. The way that works is basically because of the buildable towers and settlements, CA decided to count those towards auto-resolve. So it's like 1 or 3 towers. I don't remember how many people have data mined the game files. That's one of the reasons whenever you attack settlement, even if it has a meaningless garrison, right? So for instance, let's take, for instance, Black Fang. You put Grimgor against Black Fang, he's gonna annihilate them in a field battle in seconds. But if you auto-resolve it, you might lose half your army as Grimgor. Doesn't matter if you have, 3 Black Orcs, an extra hero, and, freaking Grimgor. That's still gonna happen just because of that inherent auto-resolve benefit. And bear in mind, the way minor settlements work right now, unless a garrison building is built, you won't have buildable towers. But it still gets considered as something. But that's not how it worked in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2. Settlements could easily be taken in auto-resolve. But then you had other issues. What Creative Assembly was doing there. See, you had severe supply lines back in Warhammer 1 and 2, so you can maintain a lot of armies. The AI, especially on higher difficulties, could and would attack constantly. It was not uncommon because of all the AI cheats, which have been dimmed down since then by a significant amount. And that's been the case since Realms of Chaos launched. People say, oh, Realms of Chaos was harder. No, the AI did not get as many benefits in Warhammer 3 as they did in Warhammer 2 and 1. Like silver ranked units by turn 20 on Legendary. And you would defeat 3 armies, and then next turn, 2 turns, 3 turns from now, it's like, oh, here's 6 armies. Here's Confederation of various factions, and they're all going to be coming for you. That would happen. And because you had fewer armies, it meant 2 things. 1, you couldn't defend everywhere. You could turtle up, play it slow, sure. That wouldn't work for a number of reasons, and you've been incentivized in Total War to be very aggressive. Not necessarily having a lot of territory, but at least taking it, seizing it, removing factions. That's how you win campaigns. But you would constantly be on the defense. And you would have the bad situation of like, okay, I lose this. Or you could fight those defense battles, be it sieges, or minor settlements, which would be open field battles, where you'd corner camp more or less, try and inflict as many casualties, if not win outright against whatever opponents would come. Because the AI would suicide itself, in the sense they would attack with a force that they felt was good enough, and then you could defeat that. It was very tedious, very quickly, and that's one of the reasons I really dislike Warhammer 1 and 2 from a gameplay, from a campaign pacing standpoint compared to Warhammer 3. Don't get me wrong. I have a lot of fond memories of Warhammer 1 and 2, but that was one of the things that sucked. But on top of that, even though you could auto-resolve battles much more easily, at least in sieges in Warhammer 1 and 2, the sheer number of enemies and the experience that they would have meant you were heavily encouraged to basically fight every fucking battle manually, assuming you could take those wounds with fewer casualties. And most of the time, because of the AI behavior and various things you could use, you could do it. Sure, when you were learning, it would take lots of casualty, it would slow down your campaign progress, but getting good at Warhammer 1 and 2 was figuring out what armies do I need to recruit to maximize my potential, reduce the enemy potential. That's how we get corner camping, that's how we get checkerboard, that's how we get ranged armies and non-melee armies. All of that came from that specific dynamic. Now here's the thing to point out. People may forget this. The player base despised this dynamic, overwhelmingly so. One of the more popular mods of Warhammer 1 and 2 was a mod that literally added minor settlements, like layouts. So we didn't just have the constant repeating field battles. We had more interesting stuff. So Creative Assembly looked at that and it's like, okay, you guys want the siege rework, you want better sieges, you want minor settlements, let's do all of that. Of course, they ended up doing other things that ended up screwing over their intentions, because it feels to me that whenever Creative Assembly is doing something, they're not really considering the wider implications of the things that they're fixing. In this case, they were looking to fix something, but they didn't consider the wider implications of what they were achieving. So, because people were constantly annoyed of AI attacking settlements, let's give settlements an inherent defensive benefit. So you can more easily defend them. Let's put towers, so even with shitty garrison, you can easily defend them. All that. That was their intent. Here's the reason that backfired. 1, supply lines. So supply lines were severely reduced between Warhammer 2 and 3. So suddenly, as the player in Warhammer 3, minus the fact that the initial factions were pretty crap, But in Warhammer 3, inherently, you can just maintain more armies, which means you have more flexibility, which means you can match the AI pound for pound. 2, they reduced the AI cheats, so even further, a player base that had gotten used to fighting with limited resources suddenly had a lot more resources to go on the offensive. This is not a bad design. I always hated that limited design of Warhammer 2. It also didn't really add challenge. Just people make that argument a lot of the times. No, it was not more challenging. It was grindy. It was very frustrating. Just pointing out. But when you add that defensive benefit, when you add the buildable towers, when you revamp the maps, when you reduce supply lines, when you lower AI cheats all at once without considering the wider implications, what ends up happening? Well, we went from a situation where it was pretty miserable fighting all the field battles, where it's pretty miserable dealing with settlements in general, because you have every settlement has an inherent auto-resolve benefit. So you have to fight a lot of these battles if you're playing a campaign properly. And it's also those minor settlement battles. Then Creative Assembly went even further when Immortal Empires came up. People were unhappy with all those minor settlement layouts, so they removed them and brought back field battles. But they kept the auto-resolve benefit for settlements. Basically, what I'm trying to say, in trying to fix that issue that existed in Warhammer 2 and the player base despised, they ended up fixing the supply line issue, giving players more flexibility on the campaign map so you didn't feel like you had to fight the campaign and push the early game and cheese the early game and abuse every mechanic. Because that's how you would properly play. Like, look at how Claw's campaign in Warhammer 2. Just sack one settlement over and over again to get experience and money. Don't expand because you're surrounded by so many factions, you can't really handle that properly. That is not good fucking design whatsoever. So Creative Assembly did improve that, but they created the endless siege problem, where if you're playing a campaign right now, the best way to do things is rarely fight field battles manually, because auto-resolve is more even in field battles, but then fight every minor settlement in siege battle manually. And as pointed out, the AI doesn't work over there. So they replaced one problem with another in trying to fix the first problem, and then they backtracked. So we ended up kind of getting the worst of both worlds. That's what's happened with sieges in Warhammer 3. And I think for any kind of changes of pathfinding, AI, behavior, and settlement, this dynamic that currently exists is the #1 thing that needs to be fixed. Because field battles, like if I'm fighting a field battle against Archaon, that should be the most exciting and interesting battle, for instance, or I'm fighting a really powerful army. That should be the most interesting battle. But the bad part is I can skip that battle. You can say, oh, you could just not skip it. That's the dumbest excuse. It's like, we play video games. We play to win. We play, like, sure, there's people who don't care, but fundamentally, if you ask people that play video games across the board, on any skill level, they'll choose the fastest path to victory, whatever that is. So if we can just auto-resolve field battles against powerful armies, but then we have to fight sieges manually, that's what people are going to go down. It does suck. The ideal game scenario is when the most interesting stuff that you're doing is also the best way to win. That's my fundamental point on this. I'm sure many people will ignore that point, but whatever. That's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Stay tuned for more.